Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon, good night to Bert and Liliane. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Welcome, everybody. Bem-vindos, né? Sejam bem-vindos a esse simpósio. Eu vou tentar falar em português e inglês, tá bom? Eneide, could you please change the slide? The other one. Quero agradecer a participação de todos, o interesse nesse simpósio. É um prazer receber os professores, né, Bert e Liliane, né, coordenando comigo esse simpósio. So it's a pleasure. I'm very glad to be here, coordinating with you, Bert and Liliane, this symposium. I think we have an opportunity to have a lot of contributions to the development of our researches. The next one. Então, nossas boas-vindas a todos, que este simpósio seja um ambiente favorável ao diálogo e à partilha de ideias, é isso que interessa. Na verdade, todo esse trabalho que foi realizado é no sentido de que possamos desenvolver da melhor maneira possível o nosso trabalho, né? This work is to develop of our researches. Este simpósio reúne um painel rico de vozes escritas. Agradeço a todos que colaboraram para isso. É um espaço de discussão, apresentação das pesquisas de diferentes instituições, os trabalhos desenvolvidos ou em desenvolvimento, alguns são projetos, que são apresentados e debatidos durante esse encontro virtual, lidam, em alguma medida, com variação. O nosso rico painel de vozes escritas reúne diferentes instituições. So there are a lot of some institutions, né, academic institutions here. The next one. Sou especialmente grata. I'm very grateful to the guests who readily accepted my invitation. To all participants for the interest, especially for sending me the material that we have shared with the coordinators and with the other speakers. I am very grateful also to the professor, Marcus Widmer, with whom I have developed a lot of work on constructional variation. I'm grateful to Nainde Mota and Pamela Travassos. So, estou muito agradecida a todos vocês, ao professor Marcos Widmer, da UFRJ, com quem eu tenho trabalhado, tenho tido a oportunidade de uma interlocução que tem favorecido vários trabalhos, não só no âmbito do discurso e gramática, né, de um grupo de trabalho com que a gente lida com essas questões de discurso e gramática, né, como também em outras atividades, como no GT de Sociolinguística. E agradeço especialmente aos debatedores Nainde Mota e Pamela Travassos, da equipe do Projeto Predicar, que vão lidar também com algumas questões, têm lidado com questões de variação. Não poderia deixar de lembrar o apoio técnico da Eneide, né, monitora deste evento, da Letícia Nunes e do Gabriel Martins na tradução, né, da Mariana Gonçalves também, né, 3 estudantes do curso de português e inglês da Faculdade de Letras que vão, né, dar o suporte para que vocês possam formular questões, mesmo em português eles estarão ali para encaminhar questões para o professor Bert. My team of students will give support for the multilingual translanguage interlocution needs that you might have. Agradeço também ao programa de pós-graduação, e especialmente aos professores Mônica Orsini, Dal Bastos, Juliana Marins. não posso encerrar sem deixar de agradecer ao Projeto Predicar, que tem sido de grande ajuda, né, toda a equipe, né, nesse projeto, né, do simpósio. E passo, então, a apresentar o simpósio, desejando a todos que aproveitem da melhor maneira possível esses 3 dias. E nele, the last one, o último slide. O dia de hoje está organizado da seguinte maneira. Depois da conferência do professor Bert Cappelle, nós teremos 10 minutos aí de perguntas, de interlocução, depois 3 exposições, num tempo aí de 5 minutos, seguidas por debate, né, discussão dos três trabalhos, e depois um intervalo de 5 minutos, um intervalo aí para a tela mesmo, para a gente descansar um pouco, e um retorno, mais 3 trabalhos e comentários, ok? O outro, nele. Bem, professor Bert Cappelle é um pesquisador na área de gramática de construções, né, com uma orientação cognitiva baseada no uso, né? Eu conheci por conta de um trabalho que eu desenvolvi para apresentar no DG, né, no grupo Discurso e Gramática. Houve uma ocasião em que houve uma mesa redonda, e, tendo em vista a minha formação em sociolinguística, levei a questão da variação por similaridade. E aí, desde lá, comecei a buscar pesquisas a respeito do assunto, porque, em geral, em gramática de construções, a perspectiva era baseada em mudança, change. Então, eu conheci os trabalhos dele buscando trabalhos que tratassem de variação. E agora tenho a oportunidade, a alegria de tê-lo aqui neste simpósio, né, porque os textos dele geraram já algumas pesquisas. Então, your tests, Bert Cappelle, have been read by my team, Predicar team, and we have the opportunity to think about constructional variation from a study that I have made to a round table at the Discourse and Grammar study group. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marcia, for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here with you and with the entire team of students and researchers. So I feel really privileged to be part today of this kind of vibrant research community. So without any further ado, let me just share then the window so that you can see my presentation again. So here it goes. Right. So today or tonight, because it's already evening here in Belgium. I'm not in France, by the way, but in the neighboring country of Belgium. It's already evening, of course. And I would like to talk about the case of particle verbs. So here's an outline of my talk. First of all, I would like to ask the question, what are particles really? So particles are words in English like up, out, down, back, and so on. And in particular, many people have suggested that they might be prepositions. Then secondly, I would like to ask the question, okay, is the verb particle construction perhaps an instance of a more general construction, and this has been suggested by Adele Goldberg, among others, namely that the verb particle construction might be a kind of resultative construction. For example, hammer the metal flat is an instance of the resultative construction, and heat the room up, which is a particle verb construction, looks a bit like this resultative construction. And then thirdly, but perhaps more briefly, I would like to deal with the way we can deal with alternations in grammar, here in particular the particle placement alternation. All right, so what are particles really? What are they, and are they perhaps just a kind of prepositions? Now, to me, particles have been treated really as a kind of a Cinderella of grammar, you might say. So here I have just a snippet of an overview of parts of speech, word classes from a standard grammar. And so you can see nouns are mentioned, obviously, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and determiners. But there are no particles to be seen here. So won't somebody please think of the particles? Now here I have a screenshot from the corpus of contemporary American English. I looked up the sequence was beat up. That's an informal sequence, of course. It should be was beaten up in more formal English. But anyway, this is just one particle verb in a context, and in the course of maybe 140 or 150 words, there are several further combinations. So there is move her out, come on, get her in, watch out, coming through, come on, get her in, again, get her in, step back, get back, come up. So there are lots and lots of particle verbs, especially in informal English. On this screen, then, I have a word cloud of very common particle verbs with some of their typical objects and further words taken from the movie corpus, also maintained by Mark Davis. So you can see some of those combinations yourselves. In large fonts are just the particles, and then in smaller fonts, some of the very common combinations that we have in English with these particles. Now, yeah, by the way, just to go back to the previous slide, this word cloud was made by an application or by a website, Worded Out, or well, it was made by me, but in that website, Worded Out, which is of course itself also a particle verb. So as you can see, a particle may have the power of turning what is really not a verb into a verb. And here I have some further examples. Mick and the boys got all beard up, or will need to tough it out. Yeah. Also, particles may be more powerful than the verbs. So we often call them phrasal verbs, but maybe we should call them phrasal particles, because sometimes it's just the particle that we have without the verb, as in off with his head or out with the old, in with the new. Speaking of the term phrasal verbs, some grammarians don't really like that term. An example is Bas Aerts. So he's one of the prominent grammarians of the English language, and using a phrasal verb, actually, he says we can do away with phrasal verbs. Of course, he doesn't mean to do away with the objects, but with the term phrasal verbs. And likewise, Geoffrey K. Pullum of the authoritative Cambridge Grammar of the English language writes that phrasal verbs are neither verbs nor phrasal. They are just sequences consisting of a verb and a preposition, is what he writes. Yeah. So it is true that particles alternate with prepositions or with real prepositions. So to illustrate this, I have the nursery rhyme here, Incy Wincy Spider. It's a well-known children's song. And we have a few particles indeed. Down, as in down came the rain. Out, as in washed the spider out. Out came the sun, and the sun dried up all the rain. But up also leads a double life, you might say, as a preposition, as in climbed up the water spout. Also towards the end of that nursery rhyme. There is a difference between up as a preposition and up as a particle. Note that if you replace the noun phrase when up is a preposition by a pronoun, you can just keep the word order, the spider climbed up it. But if you replace the noun phrase when up is a particle, then all of a sudden you need a different word order. So you can't say the sun dried up it all. You would have to say the sun dried it all up. That's a well-known fact about English grammar, of course. Now, this ambiguity between a particle and a preposition for these words like up and out and in and so on may lead to cases of humor. So you probably all know the famous actress Keira Knightley, who at the occasion of a show, a talk show, at the Graham Norton show it's called, talked about how her cleavage for the film Pirates of the Caribbean was enhanced by means of makeup. And she said, they painted on my tits as well, which is always quite fun. Sorry for the informal or perhaps too casual language here. And then Lee Mack, who's a comedian, quipped, they painted on your tits or they painted on your tits, which would have a very different meaning. Yeah, so for that reason, or for the reason that particles can occur in the same structural environments as prepositions, they are sometimes called intransitive prepositions. And it is indeed true that you can find particles pretty much in the same kinds of constructions that you would find full prepositional phrases in, as in put your hat on. That's the same context as put your hat on your head. And so on. You have some further context here that you can see for yourself. So after verbs, you can have both a particle and a full prepositional phrase, or both particles and full prepositional phrases can be preceded by an adverb like clean or clear or right. And they can both be preposed rather. So a particle and a prepositional phrase have similar usage possibilities. But particles do maintain their own particularity. So if you have an example like jump in the pool, this has an ambiguous meaning, or its meaning is ambiguous really. It could mean jump up and down while already in the pool, or it could mean jump from outside of the pool to a location that you could call in the pool. Whereas jump in can only mean jump from outside of the pool into the pool. And this really means that a particle cannot just be seen as a shortened prepositional phrase. Here's an example that illustrates that. We traveled across the endless landscape for hours and hours. If you talk about the landscape in the preceding context, then you can refer back to it by means of it. But you really need that it. You can't just remove it. So the landscape seemed endless as we traveled across for hours and hours would be ungrammatical, because here across would give you a telic meaning, and that is incompatible with this particular context here. Also, a particle can't always be seen as a shortened prepositional phrase. So he kneeled down, it would be pointless to ask, yeah, down what exactly? Or the balloon went up, you wouldn't ask, up what? Yeah. So here's an interim conclusion. we do need particles. So yes, many particles can also occur as prepositions, most of them in fact, and they might also have similar meanings to those related prepositions. But no one would ever say that just because nouns can also double up as verbs, as in the case of bite or jump, for example, that we don't need any nouns in the English grammar. So if that is absurd, and it is, then to me it would be equally absurd to claim that we don't need any particles in the grammar. Okay, moving on to the second question, is the particle-verb construction a kind of resultative construction? And what are the pros and the cons for this analysis? It was really Goldberg in a recent paper of hers, tuning in to the verb particle construction in English, who suggested that the verb particle construction is related to the cause motion construction, and because the cause motion construction in turn is a kind of resultative construction, then the verb particle construction is really a kind of resultative construction in that view. So to give an example of the cause motion construction, she put her hat on her head. Well, she put her hat on has lots of similarities to she put her hat on her head. And in construction grammar lingo, we would then say that the latter inherits properties from the former. Yeah, you probably all know that kind of terminology. So what is inherited exactly by the resultative construction then? Well, you might say the meaning is inherited, because put your hat on can be paraphrased as cause something to move. Yeah, so there is an agent, there is a patient, your hat, and there is then a resultant position on or on your head. Now, of course, not all particle verbs allow that kind of paraphrase, because sometimes particles are idiomatic, or they might have an aspectual meaning. So he put the bag down, that's pretty literally paraphrasable as put the bag on the floor. But in the police put the protests down, here you can't use the paraphrase, the police caused the protests to be literally down. Likewise, the waiter carried the food up, that's literal, that's carried it, for example, to the second floor, but the dog ate the food up. Here the food isn't moved to an upward or in an upward direction. Yeah. All right, apart from the meaning being inherited, or sometimes being inherited, the form is also inherited by the resultative construction, according to Goldberg. So note that for the resultative construction, you have the order verb, noun phrase, prepositional phrase, or verb, noun phrase, adjective. Yeah, and so for that reason, according to Goldberg, verb plus noun phrase plus particle in that order should be seen as the default order and not the verb plus particle noun phrase order. Yeah, but of course it's well known that we do have that alternative order. So the default order can then be so-called overridden in particular cases. Does that mean then that phrasal verbs are phrases really rather than verbs? And for Goldberg, that is indeed the case. She explicitly makes the claim for them being phrasal units and not complex verbs. And one of her arguments is that, probably the main argument, is that if they were words, then you wouldn't find them separated. Yeah, you wouldn't find the components separated. But you do find things like he threw the letters away. Throw away is a synonym for discard, but you can't do this splitting up with a verb like discard. Similarly, he gave right up. Here, up is preceded by right, but give up is a synonym of surrender, but with surrender, you wouldn't find such a splitting up. He right rendered is just not possible in English, as we know. There is a problem with this view of Goldberg's, and it is this: why isn't this default order as easily overridden with the resultative construction. So note that you cannot say I hammered flat the metal, this particular order that we do find with particle verbs. You can only have this particular order if the noun phrase is really very heavy and complex, as in I hammered flat the metal that was brought to me by a co-worker. Here you wouldn't have I hammered the metal that was brought to me by a co-worker flat. Yeah. But you can very easily say I put down the hammer. So this leads me to presenting a somewhat different view. I would say that the verb and the particle sometimes form a word level unit together, and they also sometimes form separate elements in syntax. You know, that's Goldberg's view. But I would also say that no, sometimes they are really words together. I'll talk about this more shortly. I'll try to be brief though. But first, let me present some evidence for the wordhood of particle verbs. They occur in a construction known as the quotative inversion construction. For example, civilizations going to pieces broke out Tom violently. So here we see that broke out is used in the same way that simplex verbs would be used, yeah? As in shouted, or in the way that a verb like exclaim, which is just a single verb, would be used. And broke out is used differently from really a phrasal combination like shouted violently or shouted at the top of his voice. Yeah, so a particle verb can be used like a verb and used differently from an incontestable phrasal combination. Secondly, we also find that particle verbs can be turned into nouns with as in I'm an inveterate people taker-inner. That sounds a bit weird, but this is attested really. But you would never find I'm an inveterate people taker into my house or people taker into my houser. Yeah. There are other kinds of derivations too. This is his downfall, or he's such a show-off, or I'll give you some feedback, or it's an unputdownable book, a bit of a tongue twister here, or this is a whole new level of fucked upness. And then finally, we also find, curiously, that a particle can occur in the V position of the verb away construction. Yeah, so the verb away construction is illustrated in we danced the night away, but we also find particle verbs in a similar position as danced, as in I so wanted to sleep in the morning away, or here you can chill out the day away, yeah, where the particle verb is treated as just one verb, as it were. Now, if particle verbs often behave like words, I think it's fair to conclude that particle verbs really are words, at least some of the time. So does that mean that there is a crack in the lexical integrity principle? Note that this lexical integrity principle is a venerable principle. It's 40 years old this year, and actually this principle goes back to Chomsky's lexicalist hypothesis, by which words are assembled by very different rules than the way we assemble phrases. But in short, this principle says that words are supposed to stay together in syntax. Well, if we look at particle verbs, clearly that is not the case. So light up can be a word, but it can also be split up in syntax. So there is a problem here with that principle. So let me then finally turn to how we can deal with this alternation in construction grammar. Most of you seem to know this paper I wrote back in 2006, but on the next few slides I will present a couple of figures without too much explanation, though, because I don't want to monopolize this whole evening. And I should stop pretty soon now, I think. But the next few slides present figures from a somewhat later publication. So here you see at the top what has now sometimes called a construct team. That's not my term, but you know, a term that was later on added to the term I came up with, allostruction. So if you have allostruction, then probably you also need a construct team. And this construct team has a particular semantic part to it and a syntactic part to it. And in the syntax, you just see that blow up is a transitive verb, but we don't see any noun phrase here. And it's only in the lower constructions, those allostructions, that the noun phrase appears. The noun phrase, as you can see, is linked to the patient thematic role in the semantic part of the construct team and appears in different constructions. Now, the particle is then linked also from the construct team construction to the allostruction realizations. And you can see that in the left one, the particle forms a verb with the blow verb, whereas in the right one, you can see that up forms the head of a particle phrase, which is not joined with the verb as such, but just is a sister node in the verb phrase. Okay, here then you see towards the right of this representation, again, the allostructional configuration, you might say, but you also see a few further boxes, which are constraints that act on the choice between one allostruction versus another. So just to guide you very briefly through what you can see here, at the top you see the given x new y construction. That is a very well-known information structural constraint that just tells you that you should put the old information before the new information. The EIC constraint is the early immediate constituent constraint by Hawkins. That tells you that, well, you should present constituents in such a way that the hearer or the reader can immediately identify all the constituents in a phrase, really. And minimize LDD stands for minimize lexical dependency domain, and that tells you that for an idiomatic combination like blow up, well, you should ideally keep the parts together. So that is why here blow up is ordered as being more important. By that I mean more suitable, really, than the split combination, which ultimately would lead you to choose blow the damn thing up over blow up the damn thing. Not that the latter is ungrammatical, but it inherits fewer constraints and fewer constructions than blow the damn thing up. So it's high time I concluded my talk by saying that particles in English aren't just intransitive prepositions, that the verb particle construction inherits some semantic and some syntactic properties from the resultative construction, but that these properties can be overridden. And finally, that the verb and the particle forming a verb together within a verb phrase and forming different sisters within that verb phrase are alternating allostructions, and that this solves the well-known paradox of phrasal verbs, namely that they have morphological and syntactic properties seemingly at the same time. Now, this variation is governed by all sorts of parameters, information structural constraints, parsing principles, iconicity effects, and something that I didn't really talk about, namely there are also lexical preferences, such that blow off steam is more frequent than blow steam off, and that work your ass off is more frequent than work off your ass. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Obrigada. Now, are there questions? Marcos, you can speak in Portuguese, and Gabriel, Letícia can make the question in English.
Okay, I tried in English, and I put my questions in the chat.
Bert, okay, Mark.
Okay. I thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to spend this symposium. Pleased to meet you, Professors Liliane and Bert. My English is not very so good, but I ask the students to help me the English language. Okay. The first questions I put in the chat and I read.
Yeah, I have to say I couldn't see the chat while I gave my presentation because I had the whole screen.
Okay, I see the questions. I can read.
You read it, Marcia, or you read?
Yes. Okay. What do you prefer?
I read it. Okay, I try.
Okay.
In Portuguese, we don't use a preposition or past verbs in the end of sentence. You have a user restrictions different from English, for example. It's a very common alternation in Portuguese. They use an adverb before or after verbs. For example, now I brought the car, or I brought the car now. When they use a notion, constructions apply the examples and present or examples above. Now I brought the car, or I brought the car now. We do not necessarily association the notion of attributes, for example, or the syntactic order, or better. I saw this is better exemplified the allo constructions. I have applied in the conception allo constructions wherever association of notion meta constructions. The account also for the analogical or schematic use or schematic property schematic. And that is the allo constructions will be the specification, and the meta constructions, the neutralization zone, it's raisable with the model. Minuto. Acho que o Márcio, acho que não copiou toda a questão aqui, só um minutinho, peraí. Estou tentando copiar. I put another time in the chat. Eu vou ter que botar em 2 pedacinhos aqui, não está indo toda, tá, Marcia?
He will divide.
Wait, question one. I see the question in the chat.
Okay, yeah, I see the question in the chat indeed. Yeah. Okay, and there's some more coming up here.
Some minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this view. Yeah, I'm actually pleased to see that many people find use in this term allostruction. I mean, just on a personal note, when I first coined this term in 2005 or 6, for the first couple of years after that, no one seemed to notice that term, and then all of a sudden, a couple of years back, it's allostruction here and allostruction there, and of course I'm kind of chuffed with with that situation, and also I'm kind of glad to see that it's being applied beyond the domain of particles. So that gives me lots of citations kind of for free. But yes, I think it's perfectly fine to see a kind of general construction over and above these 2 particular sentences that you present here. Now I bought a car. I bought a car now. yeah, obviously these two sentences are pretty synonymous, synonymous in the truth conditional sense of, well, when the first one is true, then the second one is true, and vice versa. So they are probably related in the minds of speakers as you know, as referring to the same kind of situation. At the same time, if you're a decent linguist, of course you want to know what prompts speakers to use the first one rather than the second one, and the other way around. So also you want to see what makes them specific, and then there are all sorts of tiny, usually pragmatic differences that trigger the choice of one rather than the other, that you can represent at a lower level, the level of what is then the allostructural level indeed. So I don't know whether I answer your question really. I'm not sure about the neutralization part, but I think that what you mean here, right, is that whatever is similar between those two sentences can be represented at the construct team level, and whatever is specific and different between the two variants has to be presented at the allostructural level. Right? Is that kind of what you're...
more questions? Pode colocar mais uma questão, Marcia?
Sim, pode.
Eu não sei se eu estou interrompendo mais pessoas aqui. Eu vou aproveitar. Né? I put another question in the chat.
Please do. Okay.
They find questions.
Okay. This is this recent article in the Journal of Pragmatics. Yeah. They are ignoring the notion of meta-construction for this. However, thinking about the notion of meta-construction, see that allo-constructions need to be specific for better representation within the model of the grammar of constructions. That is, as if they needed two levels of representation. Could you give an opinion? Yeah, I haven't read their article in much detail yet, but I should do so soon. And actually, I'm currently reading Hilde de Vare's doctoral dissertation, and have to write a reading report by Thursday. So this is all very, very topical, what you bring up here. Yeah. So yeah, I don't really know why they are not looking at the meta construction level. I think they should, yeah. But it wasn't really clear to me that they didn't. So yeah, if your objection here is that you can't just look at allostructions without also thinking about the meta construction level, so the construct team level, then yeah, I would fully agree with you. But I'm not sure. Yeah.
They claim that there aren't social pragmatic attributes at the constructional representation of variation. You have shown us one with semantic and syntactic forms, and the second one with the information structure, parsing. But are there other social pragmatic attributes that influence, that interfere in the relation, in the process of recognizing cases of variation and cases of difference?
Yeah, absolutely, there are.
Frame constructions, and they put values in the frames. Is that similar?
Yeah. So I kind of simplified the representation of the particle verb construction in the talk I just gave by just representing syntax and semantics part. And that indeed is a gross simplification, because there are also pragmatic aspects. Now, there are two choices that the construction grammarian is faced with. Should the construction grammarian represent this pragmatic information in the constructions themselves, or should this pragmatic information be treated as constructions or constraints, or perhaps constraints presented as a kind of construction, which is also a possibility, and let then the constructions inherit the pragmatic information from those general constraints. In the talk I just gave, and in one of the final slides, I took the latter view. So I represented the pragmatic information as constructions of sorts, alongside those two allostructions. But I allowed these allostructions, or actually, I should say, constructs making use of those allostructions, also inherit from those pragmatic constraints. But it shouldn't be an either-or choice. That's something that Martin Hilpert, for example, among many others, has also argued for. It shouldn't just be either representing information outside of the construction or inside of a construction. As we all know, there can be this redundant inheritance, right? Where there are these constructions kind of hovering around constructions or above those constructions in a typical constructional representation. But the more specific constructions can also kind of redundantly, superfluously, as it were, inherit that information and also store it inside of them. So you can have information stored in multiple places in a network. So yeah, we can talk about how best to do it, and ultimately we should conduct psycholinguistic experiments, but we can't always do that, of course, for time constraints and also practical constraints. But it is very likely that very specific constructions kind of also store information that exists elsewhere in a constructicon. And what can be stored in a very specific construction could very well be of the sociolinguistic kind, like whether something is typical of an informal register, or whether it is typical of this or that region within a speech community, or whether it is typical of youth speak rather than kind of more adult language. So that is perfectly feasible in a constructionist view of matters. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bert. We have to go to the other section of works. I think we will have the opportunity to discuss more questions, because the symposium is about variation, so you can make other considerations based on the other works, on the other research. Okay? We will have a break of 5 minutes, and then we continue. Okay?
Okay, that's fine. See you soon.
See you.